In my capacity as a journalist, I've known Danielle Smith for a long time. We covered her prior to the 2012 Alberta election, then during the election campaign, and then after when she became a radio talk show host after losing the 2015 election. She had me on a couple times, interviewed me about my book, that sort of thing. I moderated a panel she sat on. So we're, nod to each other if we see each other on the street. But one of the things that's impressed me is the way in which she has, I think, grown in a couple of ways. One is her political strategy. She made a lot of faux pas back in her Wild Rose days that cost her votes, cost her popularity. She's much better at this now, at least on the energy file. And secondly, her ability to communicate. She takes ideas that are just crazy and makes them sound perfectly rational. And she doesn't raise her voice, and she lays out the argument, and the fact that she gets her facts wrong, or they're open to interpretation, shall we say? We can be generous. Sometimes she's flat out fibs, but she's able to sell that message. And I came across a tweet on her X account that I thought nicely illustrates what she's doing. Okay, so there was an announcement on Wednesday. She had a press conference, announced that Alberta would be the proponent for a pipeline to the West Coast, and there was a technical advisory group made up of three pipeline companies and some indigenous communities, and they were going to go away and do some planning, and 6 months later they would apply to the federal government's major project office and to be declared a project of national interest, get the pipeline built. And Naheed Nenshi came out. He's the leader of the NDP and the leader of the opposition in Alberta, and he came out with a statement, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And this was the response. So the Western Standard, which is an awful right-wing rag that's run by a former Wild Rose MLA, ironically, Derek Fildebrandt, it ran a story about Nenshi's comments on the October 2nd, and with the headline, Nenshi slams West Coast oil pipeline plan. Big headline. And a picture of Nenshi. And in her tweet, Danielle Smith writes, "Why would Mr. Nenshi and the Alberta NDP oppose something so important to our province? Bizarre." You know what's really bizarre? He didn't do that at all. His statement came in on October 1st, and I looked at it, and it was like just about every other statement he puts out about an energy issue. Essentially, it's a nothing burger. The NDP has had a problem with this for a long, long time. They just don't understand the oil and gas, or even the power grid for that matter. And rather than address it and develop the expertise, do the hard work to have, cogent policies and insightful analysis, they just basically avoid it. And since Nenshi took over about a year or so ago as leader of the party, his focus has been, his message, his narrative has been really just a weak version of what Smith herself is proposing, her policies, UCP-lite, if you will. And that's exactly what he sent out, and I'll read it to you. So what he says is that I agree with you, Premier Smith, essentially, but I would do it better than you, which is weak sauce for a politician. You're supposed to be the government in waiting, and you criticize, and then you present your own better ideas, is how it's usually done. Not here. So I'm going to read it to you. Like many Albertans, we were anticipating a big announcement today with good news to build up our country and our energy infrastructure. What we got was not that. There's no route, there's no proponent, and there's no one putting money into this other than the Alberta government, and no commitment from the federal government to repeal the legislation that makes the pipeline impossible. And then he goes on to, criticize Smith, and it's vague, and there's nothing here, and really, just sort of grandstanding politics. Then the last paragraph, he says, Alberta's economy needs investments in pipelines. We need to continue to be an energy superpower while creating great sustainable jobs for Albertans. Danielle Smith likes to pick fights. She must actually do the hard work beyond the political headlines and create the jobs our economy needs. Well, look, if there's hard work to be done, as I mentioned earlier, it's on, it's Nenshi and the NDP that need to do it because their analysis of oil and gas issues is frighteningly superficial. I mean, there's no meat there. Where's, you know, where's the beef? Well, it isn't in the Alberta NDP when it comes to Alberta oil and gas. So what I want to do in this video is not just criticize Nenshi and the NDP, though I am, and I want to make that very clear. This is poor performance by Nenshi, and the guy's got an MBA. And he worked for a while as a business consultant. He was a business professor at Mount Royal University. He was the mayor of Calgary for 11 or 12 years. Voted, I think it was in 2014, the world best mayor. I mean, the people of Alberta should demand a better performance from the leader of the opposition. This is not acceptable. Okay. That being said, it's not hard to come up with an alternate strategy. So what Smith is saying is we want more of the same, what we've had for decades. We want to expand the oil sands, probably by about 700,000 to 1 million barrels a day. And we want a 1 million, this is a big pipeline, 1 million barrel a day pipeline out to the West Coast, either at Kitimat or terminating at Prince Rupert. And so we'll get all the capital and we'll enjoy new jobs and so on. And here at Energy Media, we've opposed that because if you follow us regularly, we think that the energy transition is accelerating. We agree with the International Energy Agency that peak oil demand and peak gas demand, for that matter, by 2030 is a pretty good chance, and then decline after that, which would not be good obviously for Alberta. And we've advocated for some things, and I'm going to give you 4 of them, just 4 of those that would form the basis for a credible Alberta NDP oil and gas policy. Okay, so let's start with one, which is the advanced materials manufacturing industry. The Alberta Innovates has been working on a program called Bitumen Beyond Combustion since 2017. It is a year-ish away from having a process that will turn bitumen, that peanut buttery stuff they extract from the oil sands, and turn it into carbon fiber precursor. And they think that they can make automotive grade carbon fiber at half the price that it's currently being sold, which would be huge. It would change the EV industry for starters. Anyway, and they own the intellectual property for this. So this is a terrific opportunity. And we think that in general, a general principle is that the oil and gas industry should pivot from providing feedstock for fuels, like refineries, to feedstock for materials. And this is a really good example of it. And it's just sitting there. Now, Smith has mentioned this a few times. It's not like she doesn't know about it, but she's more focused on the status quo. And this is kind of like, I think one time she said, well, if we can't export more, we'll make stuff with it. That's the extent of her strategic approach to the future of oil. Okay, that's one. Number 2, optimize the Trans Mountain expansion. Now, look, it's now 590,000 barrels a day. The operator, Trans Mountain Corporation, says that they think they can expand that, optimize it up to another 200 to 300,000 barrels a day. So let's just say 300. So now you got 890,000 barrels a day. But to get bitumen to flow in a pipeline, you have to dilute it by 30%. And so really what you're getting is 590,000 times 70%, which would be about 620,000 barrels a day. But there is a process called partial upgrading that will take that really, really heavy sour crude, upgrade it to a heavy crude or a medium crude that will flow in the pipeline. And now you don't need diluent. Now, you're not going to get all of the 30% back, maybe. You might need a little bit just to make it flow. But whatever, it's instead of having 620,000, now you have the full 890,000 barrels a day. And that would literally take all of the extra uh, oil sands output between now and probably the early 2030s. And that would give the industry and the government an opportunity to look at, say, well, is there really an opportunity in China and India and Japan and Korea? Can we compete against the Saudis and the Iraqis who make similar, produce similar kinds of oil, et cetera, et cetera? This would be a really, really good short-term plan, and it would keep the industry provide egress for their exports for 6, 7, 8 years, while we're figuring out what to do with this other stuff, like start an advanced materials manufacturing industry. Okay, that's two. Now there's three. Both China and the Saudis are developing this process called crude to chemicals. So normally, if you're going to use oil to make petrochemicals, you take the oil, you refine it, and then you turn it into chemicals. But they've developed this new technology where you just go crude to chemicals. So you cut out the middle step and you lower your costs and your energy use and so on. And China's already got a couple of these big petrochemical refinery complexes. Hengli is the one that comes to mind. And there are two or three of them, and that's the future of the industry. And there's actually a glut in the global petchem industry, and some of these older plants are going to fade away and be replaced by these gigantic refining complexes. Saudi Arabia is very close to having its own process. Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Alberta, Edmonton area and Joffre, they have the second largest petrochemical cluster in North America, second only to the U.S. Gulf Coast, Texas, Louisiana. So if, as we think, that the sort of standard petrochemical processing is going to give way eventually to this crude to chemical or other kinds of upgraded refining or processing processes. Oh, that's awkward. Anyway, you know what I mean. Then we should be looking at that for Edmonton and diverting some of the bitumen supply maybe into these new operations, assuming that Alberta can develop its own process. Number four, take more market share in the USA. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, the ATB Financial published its, I think it's quarterly survey of oil and gas energy executives. And one of the things that's very interesting is that the executives and investors are no longer worried about exports to the U.S., oil exports to the U.S. That has become a non-issue. They don't think that U.S. President Donald Trump will impose any more tariffs. They don't think the Canadian government will put on an export tax. It's basically settled down into the status quo. Now, exports of this heavy crude down to the U.S. are down a couple 100,000 barrels year over year, but that could be soft economy, refinery maintenance. There's all kinds of reasons. It's not a big enough decline to be material yet. So there's four things. Start an advanced materials manufacturing industry, optimize TMX for exports right away, and crude to chemicals in Edmonton petrochemical complex, and take more market share in the U.S. Oh, on that point, I should mention that the Alberta oil sands is far and away the most competitive barrel. So the average break-even break-even cost for the oil sands is $27 West Texas Intermediate and $7 and $9 to get it down to the U.S. Gulf Coast, down to the U.S. markets. And so what have you got? You've got maybe $36 and Western Canadian Select has been well above that for a long time. So the point is that the Canadian crude can compete against Venezuela, can compete against Mexico, compete against the Middle Eastern producers, Brazil, anybody that extracts a competitive crude. The Alberta crude is the most competitive barrel in the North American market. And right now, the Alberta takes about 60 to 65% of all of the heavy crude refining. And so the argument is, why not take 100 or 80 or 90? You can increase crude there if we don't think there's going to be a problem. So again, four credible approaches, and Nenshi could weave that into a narrative and say, look, why don't we build a domestic market for Alberta crude instead of sending it off for the least value add that we can get from it, which is you're basically selling raw oil to be processed down in the US. So instead of doing that, we keep it at home. We develop these, the advanced materials and crude to chemicals, and we build up a domestic market. So you don't have to pay $9 in pipeline fees. And according to Alberta Innovates, if you get a $50 for a barrel of bitumen, selling it to a refinery, you get $200 if you turn it into carbon fiber. So attract more capital investment to build the industry and the supply chains, hire more people, many of them would be highly technical, well, good paying jobs, and create a domestic market. That's a strategy. And we could make it much more complex if we had the time. And the NDP just refuses to go there because, I've been talking about this stuff for years. It's not like, and I'm not the only one by any stretch of the imagination. All of these ideas have been out there in one form or another. But they just refuse to go there. And they take what they think is the safe route of basically saying that, well, we agree with the UCP and, that we should have a pipeline and that we should, extract more bitumen and send it off to foreign markets. But, if you made us government, we just do it a whole lot better. And Smith, being the politician she is and the excellent communicator, twists that all around and, makes it out like Nenshi's something else. And, she gets the headlines and he gets nothing. All he's done is given her a platform to bash him with. So this is, really, it is unacceptable. The Alberta NDP needs to pull up its socks. Naheed Nenshi needs to pull up his socks. Do better because the Alberta voters deserve better.